O Heavenly King, Comforter of the Spirit of Truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Okay. So we're going to take a break from the Ladder of Divine Ascent. And tonight we're going to talk about the schism between the Latin Church and the Orthodox Church, or the schism of the Latin Church from the Orthodox Church. Originally, there was one church, multiple centers. Rome was one of the major centers, and then eventually Constantinople, but Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, and Constantinople came later, but was put into second place. And the Roman Empire essentially had four major cultural divisions, or five. There were many more, but these are the main ones. There was the Latin West, which was basically Europe and North Africa. North Africa also had a large Berber population, which is its own unique culture. Then you had the East. Antioch was the capital of the area. And while Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and of course Constantinople later, all spoke Greek, you had mixed ethnic populations. Antioch spoke Greek, but was basically, it was Syrian, and the people were Syrians, they were never Arabs, and they're still not Arabs, despite what the press calls them. The Syrians are a unique people that have been in Syria forever, basically. And they had their own language and their own customs. And this merged with the Greek cultural world in Antioch. Alexandria, here again, there was a Greek overlay, but Coptic culture and language was the root and the foundation. Jerusalem, again, was basically a Aramaic Syriac-speaking area with a Greek overlay. Constantinople primarily was Greek-speaking. And Alexandria, of course, Greek and Coptic. So you had all these mixtures of Greek culture with these other local cultures, and including in the West, including in Rome, where the liturgy wasn't usually celebrated in Latin until the 4th century. It was usually celebrated in Greek because most of the Christians were Greek speaking. They were slaves. And so there were these cultural differences with the barbarian invasions of the 5th century. Hello. We're putting the ladder aside for the evening and talking about the great schism between the Eastern Church and the West. So. But this is background. So all these different cultural, linguistic areas of the empire that were held together by Roman power, coming either from Rome or later from Constantinople, with the barbarian invasions starting in the 4th century and culminating in the middle of the 5th century with the final fall of Rome you had essentially the disintegration of the western part of the Roman Empire that for 75 years would basically remain outside of the sphere, essentially outside of the sphere of influence of Constantinople, and chaos reigned in the West. In the West, it was only shortly before that time that St. Augustine was writing in Hippo, which is in northern North Africa, near Carthage, and he he wrote in Latin, and his writings became immensely popular. By this time, people in the West were far more concerned about keeping the barbarians at bay and making sure that where their next meal was going to come from than they were about theological issues. You know, they still looked to the church, they were still Christians. They would still go to liturgy, but really they became preoccupied with life. And the barbarian invasions, the Germanic tribes, the Goths and the Visigoths and all of these tribes went through, all the way down. They went through Italy, they went down into North Africa, and they established their own kingdoms in the middle of what had been the Roman Empire. And they basically took all of the West. Justinian, 75 years later, would reconquer parts of it, but not all of it. But with Justinian's reconquest, with Justinian's reconquest, the Rome itself became a vassal state to Constantinople. And while the papacy nominally had first place in the order of the Pentarchy, as they called it, the five C's, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, Rome was really greatly weakened. And in fact, most of the popes from the 6th century through the 9th century were Greeks. But socioeconomically, there wasn't much going on in the West. It was chaos. Whereas the Byzantine Empire was thriving for a while. Then it suffered a major loss to Islam of the entirety of North Africa, and the Muslims coming up into Sicily from Italy and into Iberia, into the Spanish Peninsula, even into France. And so it remained a very difficult period. During this time, not only were people much more preoccupied with trying to figure out where their next meal was going to come from, and how to keep the raiders out of the stocks of food, but they had no time to bother with learning things like Greek, and so Greek became lost in the West. Greek was largely lost in the West by the 6th or 7th century. And there were very few people, even among the most learned, who tended to be the monks and the clerics, who could read and write and speak Greek. So, for example, Maximus the Confessor was one of the last people around the year 680 who could operate freely in both Greek and in Latin, and probably Syriac and who knows what else, Berber maybe. But such were few and far between. That meant that there was this great cultural divide developing between the East and the West. whereas the popes in Rome may have been Greek, they were in contact with Constantinople. For the most part, the clerics, the bishops, were not well educated. Very few people could read. And what Western Europe consisted of was basically monasteries and castles. In other words, fortified places where people could take refuge from the constant raids that were being perpetrated against one another. Not much going on. As things, the Islamic conquest, moving up into Gaul, as it was called at that time, began to spur a reaction, and that reaction eventually culminated in the development of the Carolingian period. In other words, the reign of Charlemagne, and his predecessors who fought against the Muslims and who tried to push them back. And Charlemagne expended great energy in trying to push the Muslims back across the Pyrenees. And in doing so, he began to have these ideas that he was going to be the new he was going to restore the Roman Empire of the West. And so in the year 800, he had himself crowned as Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. And what this signified was that the papacy changed its what do you call it? It changed its loyalty from the Roman Emperor in Constantinople to Charlemagne. Now, the Greeks, looked at Charlemagne and they thought, one more stupid, filthy barbarian who's illiterate. They had no use for the Western barbarians. Barbarian meaning anybody who doesn't speak Greek. And they looked at him as a pretender, but they didn't take him seriously. However, that began a whole series of events that culminated in greater and greater alienation between the East and the West. It was during the 9th century that you had the beginnings, that you had a controversy between Pope Nicholas and Patriarch Photius of Constantinople, the Phocian schism, which it depends. In the West, it ended in a council in 869. In the East, it ended in a council in 879. And there were two different councils with two different results. So that did not help matters. But one of the issues was that Pope Nicholas reprimanded Patriarch Photius and the other patriarchs of Constantinople for using the term ecumenical patriarch, saying there can be no such thing. How can you be patriarch of the universe? Or of the ecumeny, the whole inhabited world? Mm-hmm. And the papal claims had only begun to develop at this time. And there were a whole series of papal claims that throughout the 8th and the 9th centuries developed. You had the donation of Constantine, which was a false document that allegedly Constantine gave the Roman See this, complete sovereignty over the West. I don't remember the details. You can look it up. But it was a falsification. It was a false document, but one that was used to try and justify Roman claims to superiority. in reality, there was no superiority there. This was this little group of, barbarians, living, who were living in filth in Aachen and places like that, as opposed to Constantinople, which was a great empire still. Perhaps the most important factor in this period was the Islamic conquest, which was very brutal. I think it was 35 years or something between the time Muhammad sprung up and the time that his armies reached the Atlantic. And they just took the entire southern half of the Roman Empire. And they did just like ISIS did. You got three choices. You convert, you die, or you pay. Most people couldn't pay, and they didn't want to die, so they converted. And so really there was no great Arab ethnic immigration, mass immigration that overshadowed the Western Roman Empire. It was complete conversion. And so they were forced to speak Arabic, they were forced to adopt Arabic customs. The scriptures, the Quran was read only in Arabic, and it was and that was the language of the conquerors, who were very small in number, actually, relatively speaking. But it created this kind of radical cultural shift. The same time in the Byzantine East, you had two movements which had radically weakened the Roman Empire of Constantinople. First was the Persian invasions, where the Persians had kidnapped the cross from Jerusalem and taken it back to Persia, and then it was the emperor, I believe, Heraclius. What's that?
I didn't say anything.
Okay. Who went and retrieved the cross and brought it back. But this was just shortly before, and so there was general chaos in the Middle East with the Persian invasions of the Roman Empire, and so that had weakened the Roman Empire to allow the Islamic conquest. A little bit later, say 75 years after, or 50 to 75 years after the Islamic expansion, you had the development of iconoclasm, which created some substantial chaos in the Roman Empire. Now, the scholars are divided, evidently, as to how much chaos it created. That it was mostly centered around Constantinople, but you just look at the Mannaean material, and it talks about all of these martyrs who died for the sake of preserving the icons. And this basically went on from 723 to 840, which is a long time, 117 years. So there was a lot of unrest that was disturbing the peace in the empire, and what it did, because these forces, first the Persians, then Islam, then iconoclasm. Iconoclasm, to a great extent, came out of eastern Syria. You had Leo the Isaurian from eastern Syria, and in their tradition of the church out there, they never used icons. The icons were much more of a Greek thing, culturally. And so there was this. And then, with this Islamic conquest, there was the whole focus of the Roman Empire switched from, under Justinian, it was directed towards the west. Now it became almost consumed by its focus on the east. And so, just like, 30 years ago, or 35 years ago, everybody going to the State Department or something had to study Russian, and now it's Chinese. Back then, instead of everybody studying Latin, which they would have had to, under Justinian, all of a sudden they have to study Arabic. Because that cultural pressure became overwhelming. So basically, once Charlemagne had cut his ties of fealty to the Roman Empire, Constantinople basically lost any control of what was going on in the West. At the same time, there were some. They were beginning to kind of collect themselves and return to a more civilized lifestyle, and there were all these ancient cities which were coming to life again, especially the ones that were most important: Venice and Genoa. Ravenna also was a temporary location for the papacy during the time of troubles, and so that was splendidly adorned, but it wasn't exactly the great, some great military center. But in Italy there were these major commercial maritime powers which began to trade throughout the Mediterranean. We get into the 10th century, and the Western Church is beginning to develop some of this mythology about the power of the authority of the papacy. Not full blown, but the foundations are being laid, and it's growing from from some false documents like the donation of Constantine, but also in the perceived weakness of the Roman of Constantinople, the New Rome. They realized that there was a gap to fill, and so they began to fill it. In the 11th century, you had around 1015, you had a new event. You had a German pope. This was the first German pope. And it was under him that the filioque was first used in Rome. Back around 870 something was when Pope Nicholas had the creed inscribed on silver tablets and posted in the Lateran in the original form without the filioque. The filioque had developed from the 6th century from a local council in Spain, which inserted it because they were having problems with Arians. But the Filioque became a rallying cry for the Germanic peoples. The new barbarian masters of Europe. But it was not used in Rome, and officially the Roman Church rejected its use until a German pope came in the beginning of the 10th century, or 11th century.
Did he speak Greek? Or was it barbarian?
Well, he certainly probably spoke Latin of some kind. And he probably did speak some Greek. But probably not very much.
German.
Mm-hmm. There might have been some Greek scribes, but for example, one of the problems between East and West was precisely the translation of documents, like official documents, such as the transcript of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. The translators were very weak in the West, in Charlemagne's court, and they misunderstood that the minutes of the iconoclast Council of Urea, which had been read into the minutes of the Council of Nicaea, they took the iconoclast council as the Orthodox council instead of the Council of Nicaea, and so for a couple of hundred years, they endorsed the iconoclast position, simply because they didn't understand the documents.
When and how did that get fixed?
Well, I think by the time of the Renaissance, you had people that could read both languages.
Okay.
This builds up to 1054. 1054, there was the patriarch, or the emperor was Michael Carolarius of Constantinople, and I don't remember the name of the pope, but they were sparring back and forth, and the emperor was a very arrogant man, all full of himself, and not one to be told what to do by barbarians. And so things went back and forth between the two groups, and there had been this cultural gap already between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, a lack of understanding, a lack of ability to communicate, and then there were a number of theological issues that came to the attention of the two sides, in which particularly the East accused the West of changing the faith, and I'll get to those in a moment. But eventually, what happened is the discussions broke down to such a degree that the Pope wrote a bull of excommunication, and he sent a Cardinal Humbert to Constantinople to lay the bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia, in which he excommunicated the Patriarch. Not a good move. Well, the Pope died while Humbert was on the way to Constantinople. Transportation was not swift in those days. So the papal bull had no authority. The Pope was dead, and it was just It was just a piece of paper.
So the Pope was higher than the Patriarch?
Well, he thought he was.
He thought he was.
But this is one of the things we have going on right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's also one of the reasons we're talking about this right now. So basically, in 1054, you had this altercation, and from the Eastern point of view, it never made it into the record books. From the Western point of view, there was already a break between the East and the West. It wasn't the excommunication of the whole Eastern Church, it was the excommunication of the Patriarch. And so that was not helpful. Not helpful. But nothing serious happened. It's really a mistake to look at it as the schism of 1054. The real schism happened 150 years later. And these schisms are usually things that take time to develop. So 1054, you had more German popes. You had a gradual German takeover of the papacy. Which meant a pushing out of the Greeks, and installation of their own people. Well, which is a kind of a normal situation, but it doesn't provide a whole lot of continuity. At the time, the theological issues consisted of the filioque, the use of azymes, the demand for celibacy in the Latin Church, in the Roman Church, and then there were other side issues, but the two main ones were the filioque and the use of unleavened bread. And actually, the use of unleavened bread was also almost more important than the filioque. Filioque, at that point, had been introduced uncanonically into the creed by a local council, which didn't have authority to introduce anything into the ecumenical creed. Only an ecumenical council could change the creed. And so that's one problem. Another problem was theologically. The filioque could be interpreted in an entirely Orthodox manner. And in fact, the general understanding was that in the West and the East at that time, they preserved the monarchy of the Father. In other words, that the Father was the sole source of the Trinity, which is what monarchy means, sole source. And that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father through the Son. And the Son through the Son. Filioque is it's a linguistic expression. It means, or the que after as a suffix essentially means and, but it's not strong. It's not. We don't have that. We don't have the same. We don't have an equivalent in English of a weaker version of and, but it's a weaker version of and. In other words, we would well, you can't express it in English.
Well, so we would have to have these other auxiliary words that we'd create a phrase like,
right,
and proceeds from the Father, and sort of proceeds from.
Yeah,
I don't know, something
like that.
And well, does it well? Sort of. We're not,
yeah.
But that's kind of a vague.
Right. Well, they could have said "and through the Son," but they didn't. They didn't. But the reason that
and sort of through the Son,
yeah,
kind of weaken it.
Right. The reason that they put in what they put in the first place, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, is a quote from John chapter 17, or 16, or 15. I don't remember. 15, 16. And why mess with Scripture? You can't mess with Scripture. So that's up until the 13th century. You could argue that the Filioque was understood in an Orthodox manner in the West. And in fact, St. Maximus the Confessor himself has a treatise in which he defends the use of the Filioque as something legitimate. It's not canonically legitimate, but it's theologically legitimate, and that which is quite interesting. But here again, Maximus was one of the last of the fathers who understood both the Eastern Church and the Western Church.
So he wouldn't have wanted to go into schism over something, or he wouldn't have been upset about it.
No, he wasn't upset about it. He basically wrote that in order to calm the discussion about these Westerners using the Filioque. So you had the events of 1054, 1014 was introduction of the Filioque, 1054 this excommunication. 1096 was the calling of the First Crusade, and it was in 10 years previous to that, the Byzantine emperor had notified the West, the papacy, because the relationship continued between the churches, despite these events of 1054. It requested military aid to help them defeat Islam, to free the Holy Land, because Constantinople didn't have the strength, didn't have the ability to do so, and it needed help. And so the request came from the Byzantines for the crusade, and part of it was the Muslims had been so brutal in the southern part of the empire that it left the empire to a great degree not only weakened but demoralized. So the Pope, I think it was Innocent III, right? Commissioned Bernard of Clairvaux to start preaching a crusade, and he did. And he began to gather an army. Now, what this did was, while the Pope had come already now for 200 plus years to be the one who crowned the so-called Holy Roman Empire, or Holy Roman Emperor, which was kind of a great oxymoron, because it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. But nonetheless, it was basically one warlord over other warlords, trying to come together trying to weld together this motley group of knights. But in doing so, what they did is they essentially made the papacy into a royal power, an imperial power, greater than than any of the royal houses of Western Europe, and so it became the sovereign lord essentially of the exercising all of the powers of a state over all of these little kingdoms, and by calling an army, the army for the crusade, it integrated Europe into the beginnings of a more united political entity. Now you can't separate the religious and the political. It was fully integrated, just like it was in Byzantium. Only in Byzantium, in the Roman Empire, you still had an emperor as the head of the secular realm, and a patriarch as the head of the church, and they worked together in synergy. In the West, you had the Pope essentially become also the emperor. He assumed the imperial role. This happens in the East too later on.
But the emperor, is that somebody that comes from father to son?
Not necessarily.
It's not a dynasty. It is a dynasty.
You have imperial dynasties, but not all empires are dynastic. The papacy is not a dynastic.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm asking.
Well, it's not supposed to be anyway.
It might be sometimes.
The Pope that called the First Crusade was Pope Urban II.
Urban II. That's right. And Innocent III was...
Let's see.
He may have been the first German Pope. Because there was Innocent, there was also Hildebrand.
Well, Pope Innocent III, born Lotario del Conte di Segni, reigned from 1198 to his death in 1216.
Okay. So he was... Okay, so he
born in Italy, he was Italian.
So Innocent III was the Pope at the time of the Fourth Crusade.
He was known for calling the Fourth Crusade and the Albigensian Crusade, and convoking the Fourth Lateran Council.
Okay. So, 1096, Pope Urban Bernard of Clairvaux preached the crusade, gathered the army, and went and conquered the Holy Land, essentially. And in doing so, they installed Latins in the patriarchal sees of Jerusalem and Antioch. And they created all these little crusader kingdoms throughout these conquered lands. They also took, parts of. Eventually, they would also take islands in the Mediterranean and turn them into crusader kingdoms as well. And that there's lots of interesting history there.
Jerusalem was taken back by the Muslim, no?
It was initially conquered by the Crusades, by the First Crusade, and Second and Third Crusades. They kept pushing the borders, and then it was retaken, and then the plan was to send the Fourth Crusade to take it back from the Muslims. Well, the Fourth Crusade
It didn't work.
there were various and sundry things that happened. The Roman legate, I think, what was he had his head cut off, and which was dragged through the city by on the tail of a dog or something like that. Not exactly the way you normally treat ambassadors. So there were provocations between the East and the West, and there were also major commercial issues going on between the East and the West, the Genoese, the Venetians, and you could inform us more about the massacre of the Latins in, what was that, 1182 or something?
96, I think?
1196?
Something like that. Yeah, basically the Venetians controlled a large part of the sort of maritime commerce in Constantinople. And I think it basically came down to sort of a religious, ethnic, almost kind of class thing, where basically the Greeks living in Constantinople and kind of encouraged by the emperor saw an opportunity to rid themselves of the Latins who were sort of higher class in the city, and they slaughtered a bunch of them, and then let some other groups basically moved in to take their companies over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a mess.
Yeah.
Eventually, in 1204, the Crusaders looted Constantinople and basically stripped it completely clean. Constantinople never recovered. In reality, it went from being a city of hundreds of thousands of people and the major commercial center of the entire Mediterranean world, to being a city of 50,000 people hiding behind the walls. And all of the wealth was taken to the west, for the most part. Ecclesiastically, there was a major difference between what happened in Constantinople and what had happened in the Middle East, in Jerusalem and Antioch. In Jerusalem and Antioch, they had simply put Latins into the positions of the patriarchs. The hierarchy remained. They remained primarily Greek-speaking. Who'd been there, people who'd been there for centuries, and these were just Latins who occupied the patriarchal throne. In Constantinople, the major issue was that they not only installed a Latin as patriarch of Constantinople, is that they rejected the entire Greek hierarchy and cast them out of the city as illegitimate. So, whereas there was this ethnic thing going on in the Middle East, in Constantinople you had a full-fledged schism. And it's really 1204 where you had the replacement of the Greek hierarchy by a Latin hierarchy that you can date the schism from. Here again, this was not a universal schism in Orthodoxy. This was a schism between the Roman Church and the Church of Constantinople. That schism, the Greek hierarchy withdrew to Nicaea, which is not far from Constantinople, and set up a cathedral and set up, their administration in exile, as it were, while the Latins held forth in Hagia Sophia, with Latin rite and the whole bit. And it was finally in 1261 that the Greeks the Greeks retook Constantinople. And I'm not sure whether they really retook it or whether the Latins basically gave up and said, "Here, it's yours." It's your problem, not ours. But by that time, you had this very sharp division and very bitter division between the Eastern Church and the Western Church going on. In 1272, 12 years later, or 11 years later, there was a council that was held in Lyon, in France. Lyon is a very ancient Christian city, and it was a reunion council. One of the things that was significant about this is that the scholastic movement had just begun to flower in the West, one of the greatest figures of scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, died on the way to the council in 1272, and this whole radically different approach to theology became the subtext of the council. Some of the issues remained the same: the filioque, the use of azymes, the celibacy of the clergy of the Roman Church, but now also the issue of hell and hellfire, what it was, and purgatory. And you have the Latins trying to force the Greeks to accept the Latin ideas of purgatory and hellfire, which were alien.
What is hellfire?
The fires of hell.
So you go to burn in fire. That's what you mean?
Well, yeah.
Oh. So
Yeah.
it's a theological problem.
Yeah, it is.
How can you figure it out?
Well, because the question is, did God create fire, a unique kind of fire that burns without consuming, to torture sinners?
Is that the idea? I thought it was just for the bush of Moses.
No.
No?
No, that's the idea.
Uh-huh. Maybe it doesn't
Did
hurt.
God, and did God create a place, a unique place to torture sinners?
Mm-hmm.
And the Orthodox tradition says no.
Yeah, that's what
The Latin tradition says yes.
Okay. Okay, they'll burn. We won't.
But that doesn't mean everyone goes to heaven
It goes to hell.
and to paradise.
No.
Some people believe hell. I heard a Roman priest say, well, it's a state, it's not a place. It's a state. Someone is in after they die of their own making.
Right, but how do we understand heaven? Too, and these are really important ideas, and so and that's why there were controversies surrounding them, because what developed in the East and what developed in the West were very different ideas. In regards to the filioque, the Council of Lyon came up with a pronouncement saying that, the traditional understanding, patristic understanding, was that the Father and the Son, or the Son and the Spirit, come from the Fathers from a single source. In other words, the monarchy of the Father. The Council of Lyon said that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and the Son as from a single source. In other words, the Trinity gets turned on its side, and you have the Father and the Son as the single source of the Spirit, instead of the Father as the single source of the Son and the Spirit. In other words, in the theology of Lyon, the monarchy of the Father is eliminated. And you have the Father and the Son on the same kind of level of existence. In other words, they're ontologically the same, and the Spirit is a lesser being. Doesn't work.
But that's an implication, right?
That's an implication.
Because I've heard it expressed as well. The Holy Spirit is created by the love of the Father for the Son and the Son for the Father, the love for each other in that.
Right, but the Holy Spirit isn't created.
Or produces. But then they'll say that they're all co-eternal.
Right, but what they're doing is they're trying to circumlocate their theological weakness and trying to accommodate the filioque.
But they all are co-eternal and uncreated.
Right.
And they always existed, and there was never a time that the Son and the Spirit did not exist.
Right, exactly. And that's
so they
Orthodox.
will say that.
And that's Orthodox. But to say that the Spirit and the Spirit comes from the Father and the Son as from a single source is not Orthodox.
Well, they say both.
Oh, they say both, but we say anathema.
What do they say about when, in Pentecost, when the Spirit was sent down?
The Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son.
Well, no, I meant just kind of bringing it together. You read about where the Holy Spirit was sent down upon the apostles,
right,
on Pentecost. But I guess one could argue that did it exist prior? If it hadn't,
Did the Holy Spirit exist prior? Yes.
Yeah. But then why was it sent down if it was already there?
Well, it's a unique anointing, as it were, a unique charism. It's a different kind of. Was the Holy Spirit present? Yes. Was he present in the same way? No.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it's on the basis of the Council of Lyon that the Orthodox Church regards the Roman Catholic Church as heretical. Not simply in error, or not simply with a theologically different, but actually heretical. It's a different idea, and one that's unacceptable. So, the use of unleavened bread. In the West, originally, they used leavened bread, like we do. It probably wasn't. You have to go? God bless you. They may not have had, certainly didn't have the full proscomedia, but it didn't exist in the East either in the same way that it does now. But it was definitely a use of leavened bread, and it changed. And so there were all sorts of theological ideas applied. Some of which were better than others, and some of which didn't make any sense. But it was a perceived difference that kind of underlined the differences between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. The Roman Church also insisted on celibacy for its priests, and the Eastern Church had never done that. The Western Church, it started out initially as celibacy for the priests of the city of Rome, as a disciplinary matter. And one of the issues discussed in the council was whether this was whether this was something appropriate or not, and what were the reasons that celibacy would be required of the clergy. And so, they're fascinating debates.
What was the reason?
In Rome, it was because they required a high degree of ascetic commitment of the clergy, and that any kind of sexual involvement was seen as inappropriate for the clergy. Whereas in the East, that was not emphasized at all, or not emphasized to any degree like that. So in the Eastern Church, there's never been a ban on the marriage of, or on having married priests. And the issue of bishops being unmarried is not, it has nothing to do with, some kind of perceived defilement or something like that. It's actually, in the West, it was about inheritance. Because you had sons of bishops inheriting the property of the church, and that was a big problem called the investiture controversy. But that was a little bit later. A lot of these same, but I think underlining or to the theological issues were a part of the alienation between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. You had this cultural alienation. It was preceded by a long period of miscommunication, lack of contact, and lack of effective communication between Eastern Church and the Western Church. A divergence in history, a divergence in a focus. The Eastern Church lost its focus on the West. The Western Church became focused on its own development within its own history, but it was isolated. And so it lost the perspective of the church in the East, and became more narrow in its perspective. The schism really didn't. The schism continued to develop over the next 200 years, or 150 years. 1438 was the next major reunion council. Similar issues, but by this time Constantinople was begging for another crusade to come and save it from the Turks. 1438, just 200 years after the Fourth Crusade, and they're begging for another crusade. It shows the kind of desperation they were in. In 1272, you had many of the Greek bishops go over to the Latin side. In 1438, you had the Patriarch and the Emperor sign a union with Rome, and almost all the bishops except for one, Bishop Mark of Genikos, Mark of Ephesus, and who refused. And he led the opposition against the council. And it was it was just 15 years later that Constantinople would fall to the Turks. And with that, the schism became, definitely hardened in place.
So then when Constantinople became Muslim, is Rome was taking over or not?
Well, Rome wanted to, thought it, it thought it should, but the Church of the East, but the rest of the Church in the East rejected any kind of Roman authority.
Yeah, but the city of Rome could be the Roman, like it is now, by the way.
Well, yeah, except in the East, you had Constantinople was was the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, and so Rome wasn't able to exercise any authority whatsoever in the Ottoman Empire. So you had Rome off to the west and focused on the west, and then you had Constantinople in the east, and you had the development of the millet. In other words, the suppression of all of the local churches and the concentration of all authority by the Turkish government in the Patriarch of Constantinople for the entire Orthodox Christian community. And of the Ottoman Empire.
I mean, they had the freedom to be, besides the fact that it was occupied by the Muslims.
Who had the freedom?
The
Greeks?
Yes, the Greeks.
No, they had no freedom.
Oh, they had no freedom.
No, it was brutal.
Mm.
It was a very brutal oppression.
So they didn't have a center anymore.
Well, Constantinople was the center. Hagia Sophia was no longer
No,
the cathedral, but the administration was there, and the administration of the church was left to the Patriarch of Constantinople to organize for the whole empire, but under the thumb of some sultan or other who would control matters. So it was a brutal oppression. So the only church that remained free was the Russian church.
yeah, because they were Arabs who were not there.
Well, they had
the
Mongols. They had Mongols. So yeah, the Mongols, but the Mongol Empire in the north, basically they just exacted tribute. They didn't, and they would raid and burn cities and things like that too. But it wasn't as brutal an oppression as the Islamic oppression. And what's interesting is the Mongols actually offered to the Pope to do a joint crusade at the end of the 15th century to free Jerusalem from the Muslims, because the Mongols were not exactly friends of the Muslims, and many of them were Christians, Syriac Christians.
But otherwise, who were they? Just pagans?
The Mongols?
Yeah.
Well, some of them were Syriac Christians. Some were pagans.
What about the amount of people that, we were talking about the Mongolian occupation, how many were they compared to the Arabs, for instance? The Arabs were not too many either.
No.
It's tribes. And,
right. Well, with the Mongols, you had armies that would raid cities and kind of enforce their demand for tribute. With Islam, you had the development of the Janissaries, where sons of the Christian population would be taken. The boys would be forced to convert to Islam and then trained as soldiers. And so it was a much more systematic cultural occupation as opposed to raids, occasional raids. There wasn't a cultural occupation by the Mongols. in the same way as there was with Islam. Does this make sense? It's helpful? I hope.
But then there still continue to be contact, and
Right.
sometimes, like, if people travel, they might go to a church that, I mean, it wasn't as rigid as it is today.
No, initially, of course, the schism was between Rome and Constantinople.
Right.
That left the other churches to have their own relationship with the Church of Rome, or not. And some did, and some didn't. And so in the Middle East, it was very complex because you had all these crusaders who brought their clergy with them, and so you would, like on Cyprus, you would have these little crusader princedoms or whatever they were, and with Latin priests doing the liturgy in Latin and the whole bit, and there were the overlords over the Greek population who had their churches and their bishops and hierarchy, and I guess there was some flow back and forth, but for the most part, the Crusaders and the local population didn't mix a whole lot. They were definitely occupiers.
Because, like I read that even now in the 1700s, which is much later, if a Roman Catholic priest wanted to join the Russian Orthodox Church, they didn't require that he be baptized, they didn't require chrismation, they would just vest him.
And that's the way it is now.
Oh, I mean, so there's been different attitudes toward. For us, the big issues today is if someone consecrates the bread and wine, do they really have the priesthood? When they consecrate the bread and wine, does it become the body and blood of Christ? Mm-hmm. Do they have the power through God, of course, acting in confession? I mean, is that real, or is that fake? We would say the Methodists don't.
Right.
That's very clear.
Right.
For the Baptists,
right.
that's symbolic. It's not the body and blood of Christ. It cannot be. Whereas, so.
Well, with the Baptists, I mean, that's their belief anyway.
Oh, right.
You know, and we would affirm them in their belief.
Okay.
But when it comes down to today, it's very interesting because you've got the official position of the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, is precisely that if a Roman Catholic priest wants to become Orthodox after he's examined by the bishop and so forth, he'd be received simply by vesting, but not in Rokor. So it's Rokor has its own history and its own set of practices.
They still have to follow the rules of the Moscow Patriarchate now.
No.
No, they don't?
No.
Okay, they have their own mind.
Yeah. So in Rokor, if a Roman Catholic priest wants to become Orthodox, we baptize him.
And then
baptize, chrismate,
ordinate again.
Reader, subdeacon, deacon.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
Can that be done fairly quickly?
Yes.
Sometime, maybe yes, maybe no.
But he could get married in between.
If
After baptism.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the way it actually works out is that if a Roman Catholic priest wants to become Orthodox, and he's willing to stay celibate, in other words, no change in that status, he'll be vested. If he wants to get married, then he's received as a layman. In other words, he's either baptized and or he's maybe baptized or just chrismated, married, then ordained.
Again.
Because you can't marry an ordained person.
Right.
So his previous ordination doesn't count.
Yeah, and part of the thing is it's crazy making for everybody because there is no uniform policy. You know, Orthodoxy only looks like an organized religion, and it's not. It's Orthodox. It's apophatic. It's ineffable, inconceivable, invisible, incomprehensible, ever existing, and eternally the same. In the Greek Church, you have some very interesting developments. Constantinople is now publicly pushing for reunion with the Roman Church. And so that's not going to go over very well in most Orthodox circles, because most Orthodox will say, oh, Constantinople is becoming uniate.
Again.
Well, but strictly speaking, I mean, not that I'm favoring this, but strictly speaking, the unions submit to, they may have their own patriarch, but they submit to the Roman pontiff. See, so I don't know how Rome would handle this, because the patriarch's not going to say, I don't think that he's subordinate to, because the doctrine of the papacy for some, I don't know how long, but maybe less than 1,000 or 800 years, is that Peter, that Christ established the papacy, and that you must, in order to be Roman Catholic, you must believe that the papacy was established by Christ, and you must submit. So, like the Melkites have a patriarch that they're in.
Right.
At least they have
But
one.
he doesn't mess with them in reality.
Right.
So de facto they have autonomy, but de jure. So I mean, the patriarch of Constantinople, he wouldn't submit to Rome, would he? Or, I don't know.
I think he probably would. Or will. One of the two.
If he's paid for that.
What's that?
If he's paid for that.
Yeah, that's one of the really sad parts of this whole equation. So
then he would be in schism with the rest of the Orthodox.
Right.
But the Greeks in Greece don't want to unite with Rome.
No, it would split the church in Greece. That's the problem. That's the problem with this thing. With the schism, it'll split the churches.
That's what happened in Europe right now.
Yeah. It's splitting them in Africa right now. There's a priest from Moscow going around talking to priests and bishops and organizing Russian Orthodox church communities out of communities that belong to the Patriarch of Alexandria. Because the Patriarch of Alexandria has gone over to schismatics.
To which schismatics?
Bartholomew. and the Ukrainians. Suddenly the Ukrainians become the criterion somehow. And then the other problem that goes along, somebody told me that there was a large group in Greece that has now joined the Russian Church. And that's, so I mean, this is bad. It's very bad. You know, and it all boils down to the egos of two old men, Philaret in Ukraine and Bartholomew.
They're not eternal?
No, they're not. But it's so sad because this whole thing is just ripping apart, and is going to rip apart the whole Orthodox Church if they don't stop it.
Where will Antioch come down?
Oh, Antioch will not support the Greeks and they won't. They'll support the Russians, but it's not about supporting the Russians or the Greeks. They won't support this. They won't support the schismatic Church of Ukraine, which is the criterion of the whole thing. You got two essential issues. One is the schismatic group in Ukraine that Bartholomew tried to legitimize. The other is, and this has yet to be developed, the nature of the relation of the authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople, which it hasn't been developed yet, and it's the issue. It's the fundamental underlying issue, but theologically it's not developed yet, where it's being discussed in detail. That needs to be done.
But what do the Antioch Church want? They want to join?
No, the Antiochian Church will remain the Antiochian Church, but they won't support Constantinople. None of the Serbians won't, Bulgarians won't, Romanians, I don't know.
Alexandria was just interesting as a position in that it did, and then it suddenly flipped.
Yeah.
Not Antioch. Antioch hasn't said anything.
Yeah, Antioch will not support the Greeks. So, and Jerusalem too. Jerusalem is strongly supporting the Russians at this point, or the Ukrainian Church, the legitimate Ukrainian
They
Church.
have their own patriarch, the
Right.
of Jerusalem.
Yeah, all these churches have their own patriarch. So it's a very interesting time to look at Orthodoxy. This is Dave, by the way.
Hello.
Oh.
So, yeah, there were these two articles today about Patriarch Bartholomew having informed the Athonite abbots that they're going to become Roman Catholic, and the Roman Catholics are there's no difference. It's just cultural differences. There's no difference. They're Christians in the same way that we are.
It's called globalization.
Yeah.
Have there been any formal responses by the Athenites?
No. So anyway, what's really important is to pray for the leaders of the church. That God's will will be done, and that everybody will see it clearly. Because otherwise we're in a big mess. And how do we get out of it?
But in the Orthodox world, in an Orthodox ecclesiology, or doctrine of ecclesiology, there's never been a concept of universal ordinary jurisdiction.
No.
Which means that even the ecumenical patriarch doesn't have the authority to remove bishops and appoint bishops at any level, and that the authority
outside of his own,
and that the authority to celebrate the divine liturgy doesn't flow from the approval of the patriarch flowing to the bishops and then to the...
Yeah, you're correct.
So being in communion with one of the patriarchates doesn't mean that the authority to celebrate liturgy, that's what they were talking about earlier, that because in Rome the authority flows from the Pope down, not from the bishops. And in fact, collegiality is considered a heresy and must be rejected.
Right.
And religious liberty, ecumenism also, but those are practiced by Rome. But the authority flows down, and so it is illegitimate to even consecrate any bishop without the approval of Rome.
Yeah. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, the authority flows from each bishop to his priests. You know, and for example, among the autocephalous churches, each local church has the authority to select and ordain its own bishops without consultation to anyone else. You don't have that in the Roman Church. There's no bishop with universal jurisdiction in the Orthodox Church. And this is one of the big controversies. Constantinople is claiming that it has right of appeal, that any bishop can appeal to Constantinople if they don't get satisfaction from their own metropolitan. But then they're interpreting that as universal jurisdiction and the ability to interfere in other local churches not under their authority.
That's more like with the Roman ecclesiology.
Yeah, it's not identical to, but it's very similar. It's like Vatican I.
So it's like a process.
Yeah, like early Vatican I.
Because if the patriarch can grant or take away autocephaly, then that's a step in that direction.
Right.
So it's changing the ecclesiology.
Yeah. And that's why there's such a crisis in the Orthodox world, because it's a radical change in the ecclesiology.
To have a bishop ordained, you need 3 more bishops, right? Or you may have just one patriarch.
No, you need 3 bishops.
The patriarch is not ordaining?
No, he's just a bishop.
Ah, he's a bishop, of course.
Yeah. No, it's 3 bishops can ordain another bishop.
They have the authority to do that, like if you decide to.
Well, there's a bishop has to be elected by a synod. So, with whatever process, but there has to be an election, and the bishops have to approve the ordination of another bishop. Then 3 bishops. Usually the primate, but not always. Depends on how big the church is. But usually the primate would participate in the consecration of the new bishop with 2 other bishops.
Yeah, they have to be in the same church, like...
No, actually not.
You can have like a Romanian and a Russian and... Yeah?
Yep.
And an American?
Yeah.
Ah, that's interesting, by the way. I thought it was...
In fact, the consecration of a bishop without the approval of Rome is considered a schismatic act, and it's an automatic excommunication by the act done, late sente, by the act done. The act of doing it automatically excommunicates the bishop and the person being consecrated.
Well, in the Orthodox Church, if a bishop is somehow consecrated without having been elected, it's essentially null and void. It's not a valid act, in other words. You have to have the election, because a bishop is always consecrated into a synod.
So you don't have wandering bishops.
You don't have wandering bishops.
Vagabonds?
Vagantes. No?
I know there is one in Russia that is married, who belongs to the church that was organized by, I don't know, by him, Lev Yekuni. And they have this bishop. What's his name? He has a double name. I forgot.
Well, there's all sorts of
He's in Russia.
people wandering around on the sidelines, who are all dressed up.
The genuine or the true Orthodox Church. They always add an adjective on there. And
That's a really, truly genuine Orthodox Church.
the patriarch of like the world in Colorado, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, like, what about the old calendar Greeks? Like, now they have so many schisms, but at one time they had a couple of them where they'd have sort of a synod.
Well, they have all sorts of synods.
But are those
They're not recognized by the canonical church. And part of that is because the old calendars don't recognize the canonical church. So it's a mess. And some of those Greek old calendar bishops actually have their ordination from Rokor.
Yes. I had heard about that.
From the 50s. So that was a mess. Hello.
Hello. Wonderful to study.
How are you?
Good. So the choir is having a little dinner, and we have so much food. If you want to come, there's a lot of food, and it's all like turkey and chicken. So
nice.
Just wanted to extend the invitation.
Thank you.
From downstairs.
All right. So, more questions?
A lot of questions that cannot be resolved.
Yeah.
So, with the leaven versus unleavened thing, what kind of bread would Christ have used at the Last Supper?
He would have used leavened bread.
Okay, because I've heard that it would have been unleavened.
No. No. We followed the Johannine chronology.
Right.
And so it was not the Last Supper was not the Passover meal. The Passover meal was the same time as the crucifixion.
Right.
The bread that the Hebrew are using, it's unleavened, right? The matzah?
For Passover.
Yeah.
But Jesus was crucified on the day before Passover.
So the Last Supper was with
leavened bread.
leaven.
Arthos. The Greek word arthos. That's what they use in the gospel.
Artos, and what is unleavened?
I forgot. But what I know is that they use the word arthos. Specifically.
Arthos is the bread that is given in the church.
No, it's the leavened bread.
Yeah. Artos just means bread, but it refers to leavened bread.
But where is so important? Why leaven or unleavened? Why is it? What's the meaning of it?
Well, if it's leavened, it's alive.
That's true.
It rises. Like
Right.
Christ.
Yeah, I know.
And
No, I
if it's,
made bread.
yeah, and if it's not leavened, it's not alive. It's just
True.
flour and water. Just crackers.
Crackers.
So, anyway,
Oh, I hope you have.
so is any other questions? Comments? Okay. Well, let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption that gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever into ages of ages.
Amen. Praise the Lord.